I'll be your chair for this round. My pronouns are she, they, but please refer to us as a panel. If both of my panelists would like to introduce themselves and their preferred pronouns if they wish.
Just she, they, and she, her.
Great. If both teams could go through, introduce your name, speaking position, and pronouns. Obviously, you do not have to disclose your preferred pronouns if you do not wish to do so. In that instance, all speakers should be providing gender neutral language if the person wants to pronouns. I'll ask the affirmative team to start, please.
Hi, Oscar speaking first, they, them.
Ben, no preference, second.
Charlie speaking third, they, them.
Jules, reply, they.
Nicola, first in reply, she, they.
Neva, second, she, her.
Millie, third, she, her.
Perfect. I'm just confirming with the motion that we're doing is that oral contraceptives should be available over the counter. I'll be timing, but please also ensure to time yourself. I will try and do 1 cup at 6 minutes, 2 cups at 8 minutes, continuous cups at 8 minutes and 15 seconds. But again, if I forget, just ensure you are timing yourself. Without further ado, welcome the first speaker of the affirmative team to open the substantive portion.
The affirmative team will win this debate because we will forward and prove an incredibly simple claim. This will radically increase access to contraception the world over, giving people with uteruses autonomy over their bodies. Self-evidently, this is a claim that wins the debate. We will also establish that people are still given adequate information and knowledge to make informed medical decisions, preemptively explaining why it's the case that you do not need a doctor involved in the process of taking an oral contraceptive pill. 2 notes are set up. Firstly, just to explain what the oral contraceptive pill is for clarity. It's a medication containing progesterone. It's an analog called levonorgestrel that has an incredibly high success rate at preventing pregnancy by hormonally altering the way that your body receives the possibility of pregnancy happening. It's reasonably cheap in most jurisdictions because there's no patent, there's no brand that controls the oral contraceptive pill. It's been researched for quite a while. Secondly, I'll get more into this when I get into the preemption at the end of the speech, but we would support an over-the-counter model wherein pharmacists are seen as medication stewards, i.e. they cannot not give someone a medication, but they must explain to someone before they receive their medication what the side effects of it are. They must encourage you to go to a doctor if you experience any of those side effects. Clearly, though, we think it's in people's interests, regardless if they experience side effects, to see a doctor. But we think, generally, this is a pretty safe pill. It has had an immense amount of research for decades. It is the most common medication that is given to people pretty much in the world. Okay, let's get into proving that access argument, because I just think it is the thing that wins us this debate. 6 reasons why access to prescription of the oral contraceptive pill is difficult in the status quo. Firstly, many people cannot afford to go to a doctor, especially considering long-term usage of the oral contraceptive pill means you need to make repeat visits to the doctor, often 10, 12 times a year to continue to get a script, especially in jurisdictions where doctors are reluctant to provide these pills. Even GPs in relatively developed nations with socialized healthcare systems increasingly are charging prohibitive gaps of people when they try to go to them, which means that the cost simply prices most people, not most people, but a lot of people, probably morally significant people who are poor, who are low socioeconomic status, from being able to access a doctor and therefore the oral contraceptive pill. Secondly, remote access to doctors and in remote areas is often pretty limited, but even if there's a doctor, that may not be a doctor you trust, especially if you are a vulnerable person, e.g. if you are under 18, or you are someone in a really religious remote area, and that doctor is a prominent member of your community. It is sometimes unlikely that you'll get it, and it's sometimes unlikely there's a doctor even in your area at all, especially given, as I've said, the context where this is a constant repeat visits to a doctor. It is incredibly hard. Thirdly, it places time stress on you because scripts expire, so you can't just have to pay express fees to go to a doctor, or if you want to get Plan B, which is in this debate because it is the oral contraceptive pill, there is some kind of time constraint there. So access is limited by the fact you need to go to a doctor, and sometimes you just don't have the ability to do that, which means you go without a Plan B, or you let your script expire and you go off the pill, risking the harms to yourself. Fourthly, patient confidentiality laws in many parts of the world make it hard or make people reluctant to enter into going to a doctor to get the oral contraceptive pill. In many nations, there is a norm where doctors simply reveal information because there aren't robust laws that mean that they can't, which means that if you fear that a member of your family is going to judge you for trying to be on the oral contraceptive pill, and there are many moralistic nations in the world which see taking contraception as a sin, then you may not want to go to a doctor and get that contraception. But in most nations, in fact, pretty much every nation that I can think of, confidentiality laws are incredibly weak for people who are under 18, who we think are quite vulnerable in this debate. Like, people are sexually active before they turn 18, but in many countries they aren't comfortable telling that to their doctor. Maybe it's for the reason because that doctor is a member of their prominent member of their community and they wouldn't feel comfortable revealing that they are sexually active. But also because they may share that with their parent who may judge them for it, which we think is harmful. Fifthly, there is a context that we are in the real world in 2023 of a crackdown in many parts of the world, especially in the West, on reproductive access. Like, many people in the United States have traditionally relied on the doctors at Planned Parenthood to give them access to the oral contraceptive pill. But because many of these are being shut down by Republican jurisdictions, and because they are often picketed by anti-abortion protesters, they are incredibly difficult to access. But many nations also have laws about traveling to get healthcare, as in, like, if you are on the record as having tried to get contraception and your state has a law against that, then if you travel to do it, then you are incredibly unlikely to be able to access it, which seems harmful to me. Sixthly, there are just many patriarchal countries and nations in this debate where doctors are pretty reluctant to provide oral contraceptive pills to people because they are ideologically opposed to contraception. That seems like a massive barrier to people's access. Why then does this expand access? I think this is super straightforward. Because there are no records of it, so you don't fear things like confidentiality. Because anyone can go and you don't have an extended relationship with the pharmacy or pharmacists, and you can scope the ones out that you think will be trustworthy. Because you don't expect to have a long-term relationship with them, and you can go to any different pharmacy. Because you spend way less money on going to the doctor, which means people who don't have the money to spend on repeated visits to the doctor can now access it. Because the anticipatory supply increase when you do this across the world means that the price will go down because there will be an increased supply of it, means that access will expand. Why then is it good to have access? And this is the debate-winning benefit for us. 4 things to say here. First, many people in their world simply do not get access to contraception, and so they are subjected to 2 harms. One of which is forced pregnancy, which results in enormous harms to people. It is physically devastating. It is emotionally stressful, especially if that is not something that you want. You have to commit to a child for life, which again is a huge monetary and social commitment that you may not actually be prepared for. But secondly, you may be subjected, you may have to get an abortion if that's something you're satisfied in doing, which, yes, is a good thing, and everyone should have access to abortions, but it is a meaningful harm in many parts of the world, especially when getting an abortion means going to an abortion clinic and getting shouted in the face that you are immoral, where it is pretty risky in a lot of jurisdictions where there aren't super sophisticated ways to get an abortion. That is an enormous harm, and you may even feel religious or moral guilt, which we think is probably bad. Secondly, you lose meaningful agency over your sexual life, and I don't think this can be understated. Like, this is a precondition for people being able to live lives that actually fulfill them, independent of the question of whether sex is good for people. Like, I think insofar as people are opting into entering in sexual relationships, they should be able to decide the terms of how, when, with whom they enter into sexual relationships. Access to contraception is a precondition to being able to make those kinds of decisions. You cannot make those decisions if you don't have access to contraception. But additionally, even if the only benefit to people in this debate is just they save a lot of money that they are currently spending on doctors trying to get oral contraception, they can spend on other things. That is a good thing in this debate. Fourthly, it is just superior to alternatives. Because yes, you may be able to access ulterior methods of contraception, but they probably look like physical barrier methods, things like condoms or things like putting in a diaphragm, which either rely on a partner to do things in good faith, not, for instance, put a hole in the condom, and just empirically have lower success rates because they are physical barrier methods rather than hormonal ones. They tend to fail because things break, things get through, whereas with hormonal methods, it just stops the mechanism of pregnancy altogether. Why do people consent well into health decisions? This will be elaborated further on at first. But the key thing to understand here is the job of a pharmacist, and that is what we are modelling into this debate, to give you advice about when you try to get it over the counter. Like you would for ibuprofen, they tell you that there are gastrointestinal side effects. They would have to tell you the side effects of the oral contraceptive pill. There's more to say here, but TLDR, pharmacists. Proud to offend.
Sorry, do people mind if I run to the bathroom?
Go for it. I would love
Very sorry.
I thank Oscar for their speech, and I now welcome the first negative speaker to continue the substantive portion of the debate.
When my mental health was at the worst it has ever been, I went to a doctor because I was scared for my own safety. And she told me that it was probably because the pill I was on was very progesterone heavy, which is incredibly bad for your mental health, and she switched me to one that was more estrogen based. And I think that has quite meaningfully made a difference to my life. That is an intervention that would never have occurred were it not for a GP. 4 things in this speech. Firstly, some setup as to our alternative. Secondly, some rebuttal. Thirdly, on why the pill is actually not a very good solution at all and why it ought to be gatekept. And fourthly, on who is most likely to be accessing the pill under the affirmative side of the house. Firstly, in setup. The first thing to note here is that we have quite a large amount, I think, of counter fiat for all of the reasons that Oscar tells you. In terms of the large cultural, moral, political aversion to accessing contraception, which they concede. Obviously, there is a large degree of fiat that they are employing. I think what we would prop on our side of the house is things like broader access to things like sexual health clinics or GPs who are able to provide prescriptions, maybe lowering those prices, make condoms cheaper while we're at it. All of this is to say, I think we can more successfully provide people access to prescriptions without alleviating the need for prescriptions in the first place. Let's then talk about rebuttal. I think the main, push or unique push I want to address here is this idea of increased access, because a lot of Oscar's speech revolves around this idea that going to a doctor for a prescription is especially challenging and is much easier to go to a pharmacy. There are fewer barriers to access there. I think the problem though is that they neglect a lot of the symmetry that occurs on their side of the house, because obviously if you're in a heavily conservative community, going to a pharmacist to ask for ask for the pill requires you kind of asking somebody for access to that pill, which it like outs yourself to that pharmacist. It is not a once-off interaction. As they note, you have to go back every month or every 4 months or whatever for the rest of your life to keep getting that prescription. If, as they say, these communities, doctors are particularly, or chemists are particularly limited, you have to keep going back to the same chemist. It is unclear that it is any more, discreet under their side of the house than it is under ours. Additionally, though, the restrictions and regulations they point to in terms of things like Planned Parenthoods would likely just symmetrically apply to pharmacies and to access to over-the-counter pills in a world where they were available over-the-counter, because if they are not seen as something that is a health necessity and rather just something that you can access, I guess, freely or of your own volition, it is much easier for politicians to then regulate them because they are not seen as something that you have to do because a doctor told you to. They are something that you are opting into. It becomes a lot easier for those conservative contexts to restrict your access to contraceptive pills in the world that they are describing. Okay. Next, then, onto why the pill is bad and why it should be gatekept. I'm going to spend a lot of time here because I think it's incredibly important. I was going to explain how the pill works. I've neglected to the fact that there would be a medical student at First Affirmative who explained it better than me, taking Oscar's definition. Oh, actually, the only thing I wanted to add to Oscar's definition was that once you get onto the pill, it is incredibly difficult to come off of the pill because you have to, continually take it, but additionally, you have to continually take it once a day at the same time every day for it to be effective. That is how it works. So why is a pill incredibly damaging? The first is that it is just incredibly risky, especially for young people, to take a large amount of synthetic hormones. It shapes the way that your brain develops. I think, if you're taking it below the age of 22, for example, which a lot of people are, it shapes the way that your brain develops and grows, which is incredibly damaging. It is something that there is not a ton of research into because people deprioritize these areas of research. Secondly, as I flagged in my introduction, progesterone is like an evil, actually no, not specifically evil hormone, but an oversupply or an immense concentration of it frequently is incredibly bad, especially for mental health. The reason that things like PMDD and pregnant women who have mental health issues is because of progesterone and an oversupply of it. It is obviously incredibly bad to be subjecting somebody to such intense periods of mental health issues, noting that when they did trials of a male birth control pill using progesterone, the immense mental health harms that it had on the participants on that study was so great that they discontinued the study and discontinued the pursuit of a male birth control pill in the first place, noting that, they said it was unethical to produce this pill, and yet this is the exact same technology that women are subjected to. Obviously, pretty damaging. Thirdly, it does just increase your risk of certain cancers, like breast cancer, for example. That risk can be worsened when you are taking a supply of synthetic hormones like progesterone and estrogen. Fourthly, it can make you susceptible, or it can, because it changes the way that your blood works, it can introduce you to certain blood diseases. You can just die if you take the pill because it just interacts with your blood. Fifthly, it can lead to things like infertility because it does things like thin out the lining of your uterus. Sixthly, it alters the way that the pheromones in your body work. I've been informed that this means that it changes who you're attracted to when you go on and off of it, which is just kind of weird and a strange side effect. Seventhly, as I said, the pill is incredibly hard to come off of because your body gets accustomed to these synthetic hormones. Coming off of it has massive damages. It could mean incredibly painful and irregular periods, or really an ongoing period for a long period of time because you no longer get those synthetic hormones. Sorry. Eighthly, it's also not super effective. The Affirmative say that it is quite effective, or that it's more effective than hormones. No, it's not. You've only got a 90% chance of it working, which might sound like a lot, but if 1 in every 10 times you have sex, you would get pregnant. That's quite a high risk. A lot of people who do take oral contraception use other forms of contraception as well because it is such the risk is so high. Note here, all of the material about why autonomy is good and important is at least mitigated, if not outweighed, by the massive amounts of harm that taking this pill does to your body. Obviously, having sexual autonomy is important, but it should never come at the cost of all of this harm. Why then does this mean that gatekeeping access to this pill is good? 2 reasons. The first is that obviously, because there is so much that can go wrong, it is important that the way that you access this pill is through somebody who knows what they're doing, who are able to test you hormonally, for example, to work out which pill is most suitable for you. This looks like things like getting hormone tests done, which is like a guidance that many GPs follow. But secondly, it looks like someone who knows you and your medical history. They know things like whether you have thyroid problems, which you yourself may not know, but they can run tests which prove. Secondly, though, they know things like your mental health history, whether you would be particularly susceptible to becoming depressed with progesterone, which is something that a mental health professional, or a doctor may know, but you would be unlikely to disclose to a pharmacist. Obviously, this is better than pharmacists in general. They do not know your entire history. Additionally, you have incentives if you are having sex and don't want to get pregnant to lie to a pharmacist and say, oh yeah, that all sounds good in order to get this thing that will protect you from getting pregnant, as opposed to a doctor who just holistically has all of your health records, who is able to see through that and is able to talk to you better. Secondly though, you get informed consent, which is super important because the doctors have to explain to you, not only like you do have to listen to them to get it, which I think they are better able to explain it than a pharmacist because you're in a context where you're allowed to ask questions, they can explain things in your terms specifically relevant to your own history. But you are able to actually understand, you can ask questions, you can ask for alternative solutions. That same extent does not exist with pharmacists, who are literally there just to give you a disclaimer before you purchase the product. Thirdly, you can impose an age limit much more effectively than you can with a pharmacist. Fourthly, underlying concerns like, when you go to a doctor and you say something like, oh, I don't know, I've been bleeding quite a lot, can you give me suggestions? They can address other underlying concerns as well as prescribing the pill, whereas a pharmacist can only tell you what the problems with the pill are and then just be like, here you go, take it. They cannot diagnose you, they cannot address they cannot do other tests. So we also know that doctors are relatively happy to prescribe these sorts of pills. It's probably quite accessible. Lastly, in terms of who will access under their side of the house, wouldn't access under ours. It's people who are too young. It's people who see a TikTok about birth control clearing up your acne, who will take it without doctor's advice. That is terrible for them, incredibly risky. So proud to oppose.
I thank Nicola for that speech. I now welcome her to continue the lifting case.
Cool. Starting in 3, 2, 1. I'll do 4 things in this speech. The first thing I'll do is address their weakest material very quickly, which is on consent. The next thing I'll do is talk about access. The third thing I'll do is talk about side effects and how in the vast majority of cases, the side effects that people experience are not as bad as this team needs you to require in order to credit any of that material. The fourth thing I'll do is then whip all of our material and explain why even if you don't buy anything else I've said, we simply outweigh all of their arguments. So, briefly on consent. They make the claim that when you go to doctors, they have more medical knowledge so they can better advise you. The problem with this consent argument is they don't prove why under our side people can't reach a sufficient degree of consent that this would be a meaningful choice that they can opt into. And there are a series of reasons why people are able to meaningfully consent under our side of the house. Firstly, people are taught when they're in schools often about these sorts of drugs and the side effects of it. Secondly, as Oscar points out, it's within people's own self-interest because people know this is an incredibly important issue that has side effects to go out and do their own research on all these sorts of things, which probably means that they're sufficiently informed. And thirdly, Oscar explains to you that particularly in a world where this happened, there would be pharmacists who wouldn't just hand it over. We regulate and model in the fact that they would have to advise you on all the side effects. Fourthly, obviously pharmacists also know other alternatives. They work in the industry. Most of them have chemistry degrees. I don't understand why they can't weigh up things and be like, here are the 4 most common forms of contraceptives that are taken. Here are all of the side effects associated with each. If you're incredibly unsure about what might affect you and you're able to not take it at this point, go and consult a doctor. That establishes why people are sufficiently able to consent to this and people won't opt in the absolute worst ways that they describe. That defeats that material. Let's move on to the second issue in this debate, which is about access. Essentially, the response that we get here is that all of our material is symmetric because, for example, if you live in a conservative community, then pharmacists are presumably conservative. This was a very poor attempt at a response for 4 reasons. Firstly, Obviously, you don't consult your pharmacist on all of your other medical issues, which means that the degree of familiarity with that person is less, which means you feel less of a barrier to access in order to go and seek out and have discussions with that people because you're less embarrassed and you don't know them as well. Secondly, pharmacists don't know your parents or have the same relationship with them or other people in your social circles, which also explains why you probably feel more comfortable talking to them because they are more of a stranger. And thirdly, it's now not on your medical record, which means that if you're a person in the US and you go between states to do things like take this pill, it now means that you don't have instances of what's currently happening in the US, where because it's on your medical record, you get tried for that when you return back to your original state, because states in a lot of countries actually have different laws surrounding what constitutes contraceptives and what constitutes an abortion that you can literally be tried for. So obviously, the degree of familiarity with pharmacists means that you have way better access on our side of the house, right? So what I now want to do is talk about side effects, because that's where the majority of this team's case lies. And what Nicola does is describe a series of harms for why this is bad. But the logic of this argument is incredibly strange, because it's essentially saying when you take a drug, it might not be perfect. But that argumentation just explains why you should never take a drug. It doesn't actually explain why the risks associated with this drug specifically are so bad that you should never take it. And they give a couple of very far-fetched examples, like you'll take it once and literally die. Here are 5 reasons why the side effects are not likely to be particularly bad or bad enough that people can't weigh off this decision and it doesn't outweigh the benefits. Firstly, we already proved why people have reasonable access to information, which surely suggests that of the drugs that have the most side effects associated with them, people will not take those. Secondly, pharmaceutical companies have and continue to invest huge amounts of money in reducing the side effects of these issues, for the reason that they want a bigger market base and they want people to feel more comfortable taking them. And so that suggests to you that, particularly into the future, this is going to be something that's getting a lot of investment in order to make it safer for people. And the second reason why companies invest a large amount of money of this is because they have other competition incentives of pharmaceutical firms to ensure that their brand of the pill is the pill or the oral contraceptive that people most want to take. And so that explains why, even if the degree of side effects at the moment is particularly adverse, which I dispute, into the future, this is a problem that's likely to decrease, which just means that all of our benefits then continue to compound. The third reason why this is untrue is just because even if there are lots of side effects now, and then people start experiencing a lot of adverse reactions, then obviously pharmaceutical companies have an incentive to correct for that by making it better because their market base will shrink. The fourth reason is that people can just recognize when they're affected by side effects and likely switch. First negative says things like, you'll get a whole bunch of terrible side effects, and then you will continue to take that form of the pill. No explanation as to why. No explanation as to why people can't look at the thing that's happening to them and decide that it's bad and then choose to do something else. The fifth response here is just to weigh this material and to explain that if we can prove that the circumstances in which people who would not get access to contraceptives are so dire, then even if there are side effects for the median person, it does not outweigh the claim that we bring to you. Very briefly before I move on, I'm just going to do some extraneous responses to some of the more random mechanisms. The first is Nicola says there are horrible harms coming off of this, literally not explained and medically untrue. Second of all, Nicola says it's not well researched. The reason why a lot of women's health issues are neglected is at the expense of the huge financial cost and time that pharmaceutical companies put into specifically investing the pill because it has the biggest market base. That's untrue. And I already explained why there are huge market incentives to want to invest in this. The third reason this is untrue, and the final thing Nicola says is it's not particularly effective. It only has a 90% success rate. There's no real way to debate this other than just to say Nicola's wrong. It has a 98.5% success rate. The average reasonable person knows that and would have access to that information. All of their side effects material now is out of the debate for the reason that even if you believe that they prove that there are side effects, they never meaningfully prove why those side effects are so adverse and so detrimental to people that we should gatekeep this. Very briefly, what I'm going to do then is examine the benefits that we bring to you and weigh them to extend the margin in this debate. First of all, we give a series of reasons that go unresponded to as to why people genuinely don't have access and why they are incredibly dire circumstances, none of which get responded to. There are 8. Sorry to be Seamus Duff. Firstly, it's incredibly expensive for people to pay for doctor's appointments. Secondly, people just often don't have access in a large majority of instances. Thirdly, people have to repeatedly go to doctors because things like scripts expire. Fourthly, people often feel incredibly uncomfortable. See my earlier material about medical records. Fifthly, this is stigmatized in a lot of really bad ways, like Planned Parenthood in the US, where there are people picketing outside and hurling abuse at you, which people rely on. They don't want to go to these services. Sixthly, I already talk about things like crackdowns in the US and abortion clinics, which people don't want on their permanent medical record. And seventhly, maybe there were only seven, there are doctors' discrepancies, which means that doctors will often not afford you this because they make the subjective conservative judgment that you don't need it. And that explains why the set of people who don't have access to this is incredibly large, and therefore the benefit associated with providing them access is also incredibly large and scales with that group. And particularly when you think about the harms of people not having access to this, that wins us the debate. Because A, people often incur a huge financial burden when they don't consent to having a child. They're not prepared to have it, they have to pay for inordinate amount of food, and they have to prepare for that child coming, they incur medical expenses. Secondly, it's a huge time burden where people often just have to take time off work and ruin their career. Thirdly, there's emotional turmoil associated with all of this, feeling guilt, staying up late crying and hating yourself. Fourthly, your family just in many cases might expel you. And fifthly, there are severe health concerns associated with having a child as well, which is another reason to explain why their side effects material is outweighed by the problems with not having a child. For those reasons, clear affirmative.
I'm going to prove something quite simple in this speech. The oral contraceptive is a uniquely powerful form of contraceptive because it's basically the only kind these people have access to, which does not require you to rely on your male partner. That unique factor about it makes it worth it, even if you experience massive side effects and even if your consent isn't fully informed, and wins us the debate off the bat. 3 questions. Firstly, does access go up? Secondly, are oral contraceptives good or bad? And thirdly, can people give informed consent? Firstly then, on does access go up? Their first claim here is just that pharmacists would be difficult to access to in circumstances in which doctors are difficult to access. First response to this is just to be comparative. Obviously, pharmacists are way, way cheaper than doctors because when you go to a doctor, you need to both buy the drug and pay for that doctor's visit, which massively adds to the expense, noting that doctor's visits are super expensive, especially in countries where socialised healthcare isn't that strong, and even in countries like Australia where we do have socialised healthcare, etc. But secondly, even when talking about the prominence of their community or the risk of outing yourself with that pharmacist, obviously doctors are way more prominent in communities than pharmacists end up being, and also pharmacists tend to be far, far more common than GPs are, which means you can go to a random pharmacist who doesn't know who you are, who you have no repeated relationship with, who doesn't have a relationship with your parent, and that enables you to get that access where otherwise you wouldn't. But the second response to this is just to point out that it's super, super untrue. Pharmacies are super common all around the world for the reason that they don't just provide oral contraceptives, they provide all kinds of necessary drugs to communities, which is why they are super, super common even in rural areas and even in remote areas, because drugs are absolutely necessary for the livelihood of communities, whether as it is far more likely that doctors are difficult to access because people often just travel super far for a rare doctor's visit, whereas people need repeated access to pharmacies, etc., which explains to you why pharmacists are just far easier to access than a doctor is. The second claim here is just that they would use their counterfear to increase access to GPs. Categorically untrue that they have this much fear, because that would require you to believe that they would increase the funding of the entire medical system to make all GP visits less expensive. That is an extremely expensive thing to do, something which most countries just physically do not have the money to ensure that people have, but also something which requires more political capital than doing something like making the oral contraceptive pill over the counter. And I think finally, this just massively concedes large portions of their case, because if you do believe that access isn't meaningfully increased, it doesn't rapidly go up, that mitigates the vast majority of your harms. But I just want you to check the intuition of this argument. Clearly going to a pharmacist is relatively easy. Asking that pharmacist for oral contraceptive, also relatively easy. Far, far easier than going to repeated, expensive doctor's visits, which for all the reasons we explained to you are super difficult to do for a number of reasons. Second issue in the speech then, are oral contraceptives good or bad? They begin this argument by just listing a bunch of side effects that exist and suggest that therefore fewer people should take the oral contraceptive pill than do. First response to this is I would just note that this does not engage with an entire section of the debate. That is Plan B. Plan B is definitionally an oral contraceptive, It's not something that you have to take repeatedly. It's something that you need immediately post the suspicion that you have fallen pregnant. And it's also super important in this context because it's something which you have a massive time limit on when you need to take that drug. And if your GP is booked out, or if you don't currently have the money in your bank account to afford going to a GP and making that booking, you don't get that plan B, you end up falling pregnant, and in your state of jurisdiction, you might then not be able to get an abortion. Or even if you do need to get an abortion, we explain why that is super, super traumatizing. Second response to this, though, is to say that it is far safer than they characterize it to be. Yes, it's absolutely true that it does cause mental health harms, and yes, it does have side effects, but it's probably not super life-threatening. I think it's untrue that pharmaceutical organizations all around the world would approve this drug if people were actively and regularly dying from it. I think you should lower the barrier that we think we have to exist in this debate. But the third response to this is I'm now going to list out and explain to you why, even with all these side effects, we explain to you why it's still so worth it. That's just for the simple reason that it is the only form of contraceptive that these people have access to which does not rely on your male partner to do something like use a condom. Because firstly, it is absolutely terrifying to expect women to rely on the man who they are having sex with to use a condom in that circumstance, a totally unreasonable burden and principally immoral thing to force women to do. But secondly, it's just super unsafe and unreliable to do so and to rely on men in that way. That's because men can firstly pressure you not to use a condom in the moment when you're in the heat of things and about to have sex. They can do things like remove the condom without telling you about it. And they can do things like, for example, in the circumstance where you have not consented to that sexual interaction, you have absolutely no agency over whether that man chooses to use a condom or not. All of that explains to you why we outweigh everything in their case. They say to you that, but now this increases the capacity for men to pressure not to use condoms. But I would just say that it's broadly symmetric in that the capacity for men to do so for these reasons is so powerful that it's probably true on both sides they have the capacity to pressure you not to use a condom, whether or not you are taking an oral contraceptive. Why does this outweigh everything in their case? Firstly, because people deserve the right to protect themselves from having a child if they are raped. If you have not consented to that sexual interaction, you can't make that man wear a condom, and that means you're much more likely to fall pregnant. If you are a woman, you deserve to know that in your everyday life, if it so happens that a terrible thing happens to you, that you have a sexual interaction that you did not consent to, having been on the oral contraceptive pill means that you know at least you probably won't fall pregnant. That is massively empowering and a principled benefit nothing in their case can contend with, because the harms of having a child, especially in the circumstance where you did not consent to having that child, are so immense. But secondly, because people just should not have to rely on a man. You are the person having sex. It is your uterus. You will be probably the person who has to raise that child. You deserve the right to control whether or not you fall pregnant. It is absolutely unreasonable to expect you to rely on a man to choose to use a condom in order to do so. But thirdly, because even just any added protection to whether or not you have a child is super principally important in this debate, because having a child is so terrifying. If it means that you don't fall pregnant because you were on this pill, that is a massive benefit of this debate. And every person who does not fall pregnant when they wouldn't have wanted to, because they are now on the pill, when on their side they wouldn't have, that is a huge harm that nothing in their case can contend with. Final issue in this speech then, can people give informed consent? I would note at the outset of this that we do not need to win this clash. Consent is not absolutely black and white. People are never absolutely informed or not informed at all. We just need to explain to you why we've already explained to you why there are other principled concerns in this debate. For example, agency over whether or not you fall pregnant, that are equally as important to the level of informed consent you give to experiencing the side effects of contraception. But why is it then that you do probably have large access to information about the side effects of these drugs? First reason, most people who can do so still end up going to a doctor. That is firstly, because you go to a doctor for a number of other reasons. Health checkups happen regularly for most people anyway, and when you go to that GP for those other reasons, you would also ask the doctor then about whether or not you are on the pill. Maybe some women feel uncomfortable doing so because of the cultures that they exist in, but those women on their side just never get access to the pill in the first place, and in the context where people do feel comfortable talking to their doctor about the fact they're on oral contraception, all of those people still go to the doctor anyway and get all the kinds of information that they are talking about. But secondly, it's because most people understand the fact that a doctor might be helpful. That is, if they are experiencing things like severe mental health side effects of taking the pill, or if they are experiencing things like physical harms, they will just go to the doctor in those circumstances, and then they will be able to get the kinds of tests and things that they talk about. Secondly, though, it's because lots of this information is freely accessible and available on the internet. Much of the side effects of this drug, like the increased risk of cancer, the fact that it might cause blood diseases, etc., are generally applicable to people, which means if you access that information on the internet, you can be informed about that, and you get essentially the same information that a doctor would have read out to you if you were to go to a GP instead, and people have obvious, strong incentives to go and reach out and seek those types of information because they understand the fact that they might exist. But thirdly, it's because pharmacists are just far better actors than they give them credit for, or at least as good actors access as doctors are. Doctors often don't perform the kinds of tests they talk about because they're extremely expensive or because they don't have access to the equipment to do so, but also not all doctors are actually that great or super good at informing patients about the side effects of their drugs. Pharmacists do impose confidentiality, and even if pharmacist confidentiality doesn't actually matter because you can just pay with cash and then they never know what your identity is, they don't know who your parents are, and they can't reveal that information. For all these reasons, having access to oral contraception is so principally important. It's a uniquely empowering drug and people ought to have more access to it.
I think I'll end their speech and now welcome the coordinator speaker to conclude the substantive portion of the medical team's case.
The reason why Affirmative is basically able to stand behind a claim that these side effects are just not that bad or just not that common is because that is basically how society sees it. I did not know the side effects of birth control before I went to a doctor. I did not realize what that would actually look like for my body going on to something like birth control. And when the first birth control I tried did not work for me and had significant side effects, it was going to a doctor who was able to tell me, okay, well, let's try something else. Let's try another thing that was actually able to give me the benefit. And because of all the reasons they're able to stand behind to suggest that birth control, it's just fine for most people, is the exact way that people in their world see birth control, and therefore it is the exact reasons why pharmacists don't spend that much time on explaining things, or even when the side effects are explained, people are far more likely to just be like, oh, it's all right because I know all these people are on it and they're fine on it, so I'll probably be fine on it as well, noting that things like birth control are actually specifically very unique to your own set of hormones, your own specific health history, and those things were incredibly important. I'm going to do a couple of things in this speech. I'm firstly going to remove their first pathway to winning, which is basically that this is the only form of birth control that is that gives you the ability to not rely on your male partner, and that's incredibly important. There are a couple of reasons why this claim cannot win them the debate. First, I think the first thing to prove is basically that there are other options that are not male, that are not necessary for your male partner to have that you are able to instead choose. For example, things like female condoms. And in our world, what we tell you is things like sexual health clinics, which we even if you don't believe that we're able to drastically change the entire way the GP system is set up, things just having more access to female condoms is obviously something we were able to support in our world that required I think even probably less fiat because you're literally not changing anything about your body. Being able to just have more access to things like female condoms and those sorts of things are obviously things we're able to defend and things we set up quite clearly to you at first. So those are things that were able to be led just by you that were not necessary for you to have a male partner for your male partner to tell you about. Anyway, I think the second thing to note also though is that again, if there is something happens that occurs with a condom, etc., that breaks, you can take Plan B the next day. Notably, Plan B is an over-the-counter thing. It doesn't act the same as an oral that is not the same. This is not. I don't think that falls into the debate in the sense of Plan B is literally something that is currently over like the counter available. That was always an option for women to take if something occurred. They were able to have reproductive control over their body in lots of other ways other than just having like oral contraception. That was obviously something they were able to do. And secondly, we tell you that this actually worsens for women under their world. And Charlie decides to say like, oh, well, it's basically the same because like the pressure was coercive either way. This literally just gives like people an opportunity to be like, well, you should go on the pill because it's so easily available to everyone. You should go on it. That's actually a very unique way to frame this. Like, just be like, we'll just go and get on the pill instead. Obviously, in our world, women are able to say like, I just don't want to. Like, I don't have access to it. That's not something that like, I necessarily need. So I think you actually far increase the pressure on people in the first place. Also just like noting things like, you can get like things like IUDs, etc., like all of these sorts of things that are other forms of birth control that are women, like that are able to be had specifically by women. That was incredibly important. It meant that this pathway to winning did not actually occur because firstly, you had the other options like female condoms that we were able to proliferate on our side. That meant that this pathway to winning was out of the debate. Secondly then, on, in terms of access to birth control, I'm going to explain this by a couple of different metrics in terms of explaining why access to birth control does not necessarily increase on their side in the first place anyway. They say that, well, it's fine now because birth control is just actually reasonably cheap, and like this means just more people can access it. Firstly, untrue that birth control is just consistently always cheap. I'm fairly sure mine is about like $70 for like each time I have to go and get it in the first place anyway, and I'm fairly sure that like is true, and especially even if you don't believe it's like that expensive, I am sure mine is, but like even if you don't believe all of them are that expensive, over time this actually does increase quite a lot, whereas like a packet of like condoms is actually far less expensive and is like actually like a far, I guess, more accessible way for people to use them, especially if you believe that female condoms, etc., can also be really helpful for women. But I think that's like, especially if you're taking over a long period of time, which is what is necessary for birth control, I don't think it actually becomes cheaper in the first place. But secondly, I think also if you're someone who's unable to access a doctor because of that money, it's unclear that you're able to pay this now extremely high fee of like, I guess, giving lots of like money in being able to like purchase birth control. They say, be comparative because at least it's still less than doctors. But this is when all the terrible side effects that we tell you come into play, because obviously it is untrue that just by making something a little bit less cheaper, that is not a pathway to winning this debate. If we are able to prove that just by making it a little bit less cheaper, this opens up a massive amounts of people to significant side effects that occur for them on a regular basis, that is incredibly like terrible. And I'll explain those in a second. But I think secondly, their whole idea of this helping people who access it, who now do not have like fear of judgment, etc., also just does not come true, because like pharmacists, we literally tell you like lowering your voice in a pharmacist when there's just like a couple of people in the background and you already feel that fear and internal shame about trying to buy this. It's obviously far easier when you're in a private room with a doctor. I don't think this increases access, especially in places that are extremely conservative, because probably it's uncomfortable to like say that in front of lots of people perhaps who are already in the pharmacy. They say, well, pharmacies themselves are just there are so many more pharmacies than doctors. But I would note that this is only true, I think, in like places like Sydney, where like maybe like you just get more pharmacies. But in like a rural town, you literally just have the one pharmacy and the one doctor. Like, that's just untrue. You don't have 5 pharmacies like all around you in your rural town, and it's unclear as to how you can just go out and now find that. Like, it's unclear as to how, if you're especially a teenager, that you're now suddenly just going to go and take a 20k drive somewhere else to find a different pharmacy, because that was just as inaccessible to you other than just using your doctor. So at the end of that, I don't think they're able to improve access to it in either of those ways. And I think thirdly, actually conservative countries are probably likely to increase things like taxes on these birth control things anyway, for all the reasons they tell you that they hate these things and these things are seen as morally bad. And we tell you that at Neva, which gets no response, which is that these places obviously do not actually want to be giving these things out, so they're going to make it as difficult as possible, I think, for women to be able to access them in the first place anyway. Finally then, on our pathway to winning, which is proving that consent cannot occur and the side effects of these pills are bad enough that you should definitely have to see a doctor to be able to get this. They say consent can occur because of things like sex education. Obviously, just empirically, I'm sure, I think Neva deals with that pretty well, especially in conservative states where there's literally no curriculum that tells you have to do these things. Secondly, they tell you it's in your own interests to go out and research these side effects. But I would note that it's very actually hard to attribute the side effects that you feel to the pill. That is, for example, feeling extremely depressed, you don't necessarily always link to the pill. I think majority of people are just maybe it's something going on in my life, like I don't know what's going on. Especially as we tell you, the pill is broadly seen as like quite good in society, like everyone's like a bit like, what do you do about it? So I think you're actually unlikely to attribute it. But secondly, you can't do any of your own testing on it. You don't actually know anything about this. You don't know what that looks like. And then I think that the third thing they say in terms of like why consent is able to exist is because pharmacists have to explain, and this is just going to be so good. Firstly, pharmacists explain the general side effects. They do not explain the side effects that are specific to you and your unique history. We know that consent should be unique. It should be specific to exactly what you are opting into. That was something that uniquely doctors could provide to these people. What this looks like is if you have a thyroid problem and you go in and they like lift off like the general side effects, blah blah blah. You're like yep, cool. You literally can die from this. This is not even exaggeration. Like this is not exaggeration. This is genuinely horrific for people. This ruins people's lives. It fucks up their hormones for like a considerably long time. That was obviously a terrible thing to do. They say there's a market incentive to prove these things when they're widely proliferated, but this is obviously untrue. The most privileged people are on the pill right now, and the market has never changed to actually make pills far better at all in any way. Now something that you're just increasing access maybe to a larger group of people who are underprivileged does not mean that you get these significant benefits in the pill at all that exist. And also just Big Pharma consistently denies things that's not in their interest, like rerun trials, especially if they're able to get enough buy-in in the first place to make the pill all better. At the end of this debate, they have no pathway left to winning. We had better alternatives that were women-led for contraception. They did not get better access. And finally, this was significantly bad, even if they did get access. This killed people. This was terrible. Thank you.
Thanks. I thank Millie for my speech, and I now welcome the negative reply to conclude negative team's case.
Two things in this speech. Firstly, looking at their paths to victory and why they all fail, and even if they are have some merit, why they do not weigh up against our path to victory, which I think is much stronger. What did they try to do to win this debate? The three, I think, broadest pushes, or most compelling pushes from the affirmative team were this. The first was that having a child is harmful, and therefore we ought to do everything possible to prevent having a child, even if that incurs significant risk or significant damage to the person who would otherwise be potentially bearing that child. Three responses we provide you down the bench. The first is that we just point out that this is not the only contraceptive method. We point to condoms as like a pretty easy, pretty cheap, pretty accessible way of preventing childbirth. But then we also suggest things like other forms of contraception, such as like IUDs or diaphragms that do not rely on having a male counterpart, which I'll get to in a second. Obviously, these other methods do exist. The pill is not the only type of contraception that there is. The second thing that we point to is that the pill is not super effective. For it to be effective, you do have to take it, religiously at a certain time of day. I don't know anyone who is able to do that. People have schedules, etc. We tell you this at Neva. What this means is that the efficacy of it is massively degraded. Lastly, though, all of the harms we point to you, the side effects, which I'll get onto in a second, are unique to the pill, which is a trade-off that you do not have to make, for example, with something like condoms. What this means is that, yes, having a child is damaging. We're not going to challenge that, but we challenge the idea that this is the only way you can prevent people from having children that they do not want. We challenge that this is the best way of preventing people having children that they do not want. Secondly, then, on the issue of autonomy and the control that you have over your own contraception. Again, we already pointed to the other methods that exist, things like IUDs, things like diaphragms. It's not true that this is an exclusive benefit. But secondly, we tell you at Neva that it actually makes it easier to justify not using a condom if there is an expectation that more people are using birth control or using oral contraception. What this means is that it is just more likely to increase people not using condoms, which is bad, not only because, as we said, oral contraception can fail, but additionally, they prevent things like STIs. It's probably good for your own body that you are able to, in as many cases as possible, assert, things like the use of additional or other forms of contraception. Obviously, this is not the case in every case. Note, though, that they are an extreme minority of cases. We're talking about putting every single person who is taking the pill at extreme amounts of risk. Obviously, that is a much greater and much more common risk. The last push that we get from them is that pharmacists are actually pretty good. In fact, they're better than doctors. 6 responses that we bring you. The first is that doctors know you. They know your history. Pharmacists categorically do not. That is why they say that they are good. Obviously, knowing your history is incredibly important when you're prescribing something that is dependent on the way that the efficacy and the side effects of you are dependent on the way that your body functions. It is important that you're talking to someone who knows the way your body functions. Secondly, doctors can do tests. They may not always do tests, but they can. Pharmacists cannot, and they tell you that. Thirdly, doctors can answer questions. They are more able to engage with you at a level that you understand, rather than a pharmacist who has customers lined up waiting for them. We tell you this down the bench. Fourthly, there's confidentiality that exists. I guess we have pharmacist confidentiality. Pretty difficult to be confidential when you're talking to someone in the middle of a pharmacy. Fifthly, we tell you that they are symmetrically conservative. In cultures where there is an aversion to contraception in general, it's hard to see why a pharmacist would be, any less judgmental than a doctor would when prescribing them. Sixthly, to no response, we tell you it is easier to regulate contraception badly when it is not seen as a health necessity, but rather something that people just opt into. Look at the way that abortions are treated when they are not medically necessary versus medically necessary. Obviously, it is something a doctor is prescribing. I tell you this at first speaker, it is something that is much harder to crack down on. We prefer that. Let's then weigh this up against the side effects. Side effects are something that are guaranteed. They could try to mitigate this and say that they are not. Most people who are on the pill suffer because of it. Maybe there are some benefits, but they are actively suffering because of it. We tell you that it is guaranteed that things like synthetic hormones are bad for young people. And there are also just massive amounts of speculative risk. Therefore, it is imperative that this access to this pill is screened. It is imperative that you have to get a prescription in the first place. These harms are massive. They incur to everyone who goes on the pill. It is imperative that they consent to this harm. Therefore, massive benefit, we win the debate.
I thank Nicola for that speech. I now welcome the affirmative reply speaker to conclude today's debate. Woo!
A side-negative strategy that tries to argue at its core that the side effects of the pill are inherently bad, that the medical system has failed women, and these are underdeveloped drugs in their very existence, is not enough to win this debate. Because as they acknowledge themselves, most people in this room know that the average person probably is using the pill. They know stories of people who have used it, and it is consistently prescribed by doctors. And that is for the very reason that it is the best that we have at this present moment. And both sides acknowledge that. It would be nice if IUDs could be accessible to everybody. Most people know that they would be better, and most people would prefer to have them. The problem is that people cannot access IUDs, and people, if they have to rely on condoms, which are far less effective, as is empirically proven, than these contraceptive drugs, probably means that things like mistaken pregnancies are just far more likely. This negative team fails to be comparative, and that is the reason they lose this debate. I'm going to start my reply just an analysis about why we are able to minimize the harms that they say are likely to exist with these drugs. The first observation I would like to make is that they acknowledge that a lot of these harms are already embedded in the drug itself. So it's unclear why telling someone about the implications of the drug that would happen would be the life changer in stopping those harms from accruing, because they talk about a system at the moment where you must have a doctor, but continues to accrue harm, so unclear what their winning strategy is there. Noting also, we tell you there are lots of reasons why people, if they are facing harm, are likely to either go to a doctor if they have the capacity to do so, or if they have a bunch of other reasons why a pill wouldn't work, would be likely to access it. That means that people who can access it would probably use a doctor where it is available, and if people have problems, they are likely to do things like seek the internet. At the very least, that neutralizes the consent issue, because under both worlds, people have a reasonable knowledge of a drug, which perhaps may cause them harm, but was unclear why a doctor telling them of that harm a little bit more nicely than a pharmacist was life-changing in that regard. So that means that we can minimize some significant impact of that. Then moving on to the claims that we get from negative as to why we should be discouraging the use of contraceptives. Noting, first of all, all their analysis about how condoms aren't enough, and that you can do things like rely on female condoms and somehow make that industry better in a counter model, was entirely unproven and probably shouldn't be that persuasive. You know that it relies on a male partner, you know that it relies on the heat of the moment, and as unresponded to, may just be incredibly important when you're talking about things like sexual assault. They then try and prop that Plan B isn't in this debate because you can access over the counter, noting that's an assertion just because it exists in Australia, it should exist everywhere else. That was unproven. But additionally, it's unclear as to why it can be considered a long-term response as to every time you have sex, you should be taking the Plan B pill. So at the very least, there are some harms that are accompanied by this drug. But these harms are accrued because people know of the risks, and because the risks are in the hopes that they aren't not facing things like unplanned pregnancy. And that means that in this debate, what really matters is the subset of people who are having sex and who perhaps are using condoms because they're less expensive, but who want to access contraceptives because they know that it would be better for them. These are people who perhaps cannot access the status quo because the doctors are far less likely to be found everywhere and have a large amount of competition in a lot of areas. That because, for example, it's more expensive to pay for a doctor and a drug, you might be dissuaded for something from having less money, maybe even less money to put towards condoms. And lastly, because there's a large amount of fear that comes from the intimacy that you have with a doctor who's likely to be prominent in society, and because a lot of these are given via Planned Parenthood. Additionally, the own mechanism they tell you about trying to gatekeep these means obviously there's a far more subjectivity. That means there is a group of people who at the moment are relying on forms of contraceptive that are less effective and that are more likely to face things like unwanted pregnancy, like having to go through the stress of an abortion, of having the absolute horrors of relying on these other systems not working and having to deal with a pregnancy. That was incredibly damning because it meant there were people who were accessing forms of contraceptive that were not enough and wanted to access better. Perhaps there were side effects, but those were side effects that they were able and willing to take to try and protect themselves from pregnancy. Never been prouder to affirm.
Woohoo! Congratulations to all speakers on that debate. Feel free to cross the floor and shake hands or bump elbows. And please back to the briefing room. We're now ready to